There are a few scattered and largely unrecorded stories about enslaved people in America who were described as hermaphrodites, an older term for what we now call intersex individuals. But because of the times and the cruelty of slavery, most of these stories were buried, misrepresented, or told from the perspective of enslavers rather than the people themselves. One of the most frequently mentioned stories involves a slave known only as the Hermaphrodite Slave, who lived in the early 1800s in the American South. Here's the story as it's been told through oral accounts and fragments found in 19th century writings.
The story of the Hermaphrodite Slave and Colonel Harris. According to oral tradition, there was an enslaved person who lived on a plantation owned by a man sometimes referred to as Colonel Harris. The enslaved person was born with both male and female physical traits, something deeply misunderstood at the time. Because of this, they were treated as a curiosity and subjected to invasive and humiliating treatment from both enslavers and others on the plantation. Colonel Harris was reportedly cruel and exploitative, forcing this person to work both in the fields and in the house, taking advantage of their ambiguous sex for entertainment and abuse. From what's known through oral history and scattered 19th century accounts, Colonel Harris and his wife treated the intersex slave as something less than human, rather than as a person with dignity. Because people at that time had no understanding of intersex conditions, they reacted with cruelty, ridicule, and exploitation. Here's what's generally described in those retellings. 1. Public humiliation. Colonel Harris would display the enslaved person to guests as a curiosity, forcing them to stand half-clothed or be examined, turning their body into entertainment. 2. Forced labor and isolation. The person was made to work both in the fields and in the house, a way of showing that they belonged nowhere. They were often kept apart from other enslaved people to prevent social connection or sympathy. 3. Physical and verbal abuse. Both Harris and his wife reportedly taunted and beat them for any small reason, calling them names that implied monstrosity. The wife, according to some versions, joined in the cruelty to reassert her own power over someone even more vulnerable. 4. Sexual violation. Many retellings mention repeated assaults by Harris. Colonel Harris and his wife abused the intersex slave, born both male and female, endured unimaginable abuse at the hands of a plantation master and his wife. They worked from sunrise to sunset, in the fields, then in the house, with little rest and no privacy. They were beaten for the smallest mistakes and constantly called names that marked them as unnatural. Harris even sexually assaulted them, using their body as a tool to assert control while the wife watched or participated. This relentless cruelty, physical, mental, and emotional, built years of torment. But the enslaved person's spirit wasn't broken forever, and that anger would later turn into an act of bold resistance that shook the plantation to its core. These acts were meant to assert control, not desire. The same form of sexualized violence inflicted on countless enslaved people, made even more degrading here because of the person's intersex body. 5. Psychological torment. The enslaved person was told they were unnatural and cursed. Their body was used as justification for punishment, a daily reminder that they were treated as property and experiment rather than as human. These abuses built up over years until that final moment of resistance when the enslaved person struck back. The enslaved person, whose name has been lost to history, was said to have endured years of torment and ridicule. Over time, the story goes that the enslaved person's suffering turned to resistance. After a particularly violent incident, some versions say Colonel Harris attempted another assault, the enslaved individual struck back, killing him with a tool or weapon at hand, often described as a hoe, axe, or blade. They did not flee. When captured, they reportedly said something like, open quote, "I have lived as both man and woman, but never as free. Better death than chains." Close quote. The enslaved person was quickly executed, either by hanging or burning. The records differ. Local newspapers and slaveholders at the time sensationalized the case, labeling it a monstrous murder by a hermaphrodite slave. But among enslaved people, the story was whispered differently, as a tragic but powerful act of rebellion, a person who had been denied identity, dignity, and freedom choosing their own ending rather than enduring more cruelty. Why the story matters. This story reflects how intersex enslaved people were doubly marginalized by race and by their bodies. Slavery denied any sense of self or autonomy, and being intersex made a person even more vulnerable to abuse and dehumanization. The tale survived through oral storytelling in the African American community, especially in the South, as a symbol of defiance and as a reminder that resistance took many forms, including acts that went unrecorded or were erased from written history. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Black History Stories 13. Turn on the bell so you never miss a story.